Okay, so today's lecture is accessibility and inclusion. Officially in the curriculum, we only talk about accessibility. I'm extending it slightly to include inclusion because I think that by being accessible, you make your solutions inclusive of people of all walks of life. So accessibility is the means, inclusion is the end. And when you think about inclusion as the end, can help dictate your decisions a little bit more holistically than just accessibility. So we'll get into what is accessibility and what is inclusion. Instead of having Sean talk to you, I have two videos that I'd like to share. And then some very tactical things, some guidelines about accessibility, some tips and some tools. So let's address what the definitions of these two topics are. So can I have somebody read this?
Accessibility refers to users' ability to actually use products and services. Parentheses, this is separate from considering if they also achieve their goals, which would be usability.
So they're related. So if something's not accessible, somebody can't actually physically use it for whatever reason, physical, mental, whatever. And then if they can use it, is it usable? So accessibility is kind of more foundational than usability. And a designer's ultimate goal is to anticipate and accommodate all users, including those with disabilities. But I'm going to take a moment, a pause, a step back, to challenge what we think about as a disability and really get critical on how all of us in this room either currently are or at one point have been disabled. If we broaden our perspective on what that means. So the reason I'm doing this is often in industry and in my personal experience, accessibility is either not thought of and not thought of soon enough. Therefore, you're not really going to be inclusive of other types of people. It's written about and spoken about in our industry in tech that design doesn't have a seat at the table, that we don't get involved early enough, and our collective gripe is that we can't advocate for the user, so things get designed that people don't actually, things get made that people don't actually want or need, and they don't get designed. Design is at the end, so it's like putting lipstick on a pig. So if involving designers too late results in bad products that people don't want or need, then in the design world, adding accessibility and inclusion too late is like putting lipstick on a pig in the same way. So this is from Microsoft's Inclusion and Accessibility Hub online. And so these are their design principles for accessibility and inclusion. So if they're solving for one, their persona extends to many. So we talked about secondary personas and anti-personas. So can someone read this card here?
Solve for one, extend to many. Everyone has abilities and limits to those abilities. Designing for people with permanent disabilities actually results in designs that benefit people universally. Constraints are a beautiful thing.
So for instance, one element of accessibility is making things keyboard accessible for people who don't have fine motor control to use a mouse. A side benefit of this is power users often don't use the mouse, they use keyboard shortcuts. And people of different personalities, working styles, and preferences can benefit able-bodied people from the decisions that you made to accommodate people that have disabilities. So this is somebody who's permanently blind, this picture here. So think about this for a second. So what in your world have you encountered today, the last week, that now that you think about it for a second, were designed with features or in a way that made them accessible? Could be anything, doesn't have to be digital. Does anyone have any ideas?
So that wouldn't be considered accessible?
That would.
Oh, that would.
Sorry. Let's do would and wouldn't, both. Both are fine.
I think there's an interesting thing to bring up for would.
Okay.
And then like there are all those like weird products that people bring up that are like I saw one the other day that's like if you wanna like have a seat that goes with you everywhere that you can like sit down on, like it's retractable.
Oh, yeah.
They market those as like products for people and people are like, this is ridiculous, but those are products that are made for people who are disabled and then they have to sell them to more people to be like market viable.
I know the ones you're talking about. I think actually initially they were made for surgeons that need to stand up most of the day.
Yeah, I don't know if that was
But yeah, it's a good point that like there's different use cases where people are put into extreme circumstances. Just like we have that bell curve of user behavior we've talked about. Like you have people that are able-bodied in the middle and people that are like extra able and then disabled in terms of the percentage. So something designed for one can be extended to many in that way. But what's something that you've used that is explicitly not? Or either one?
I was gonna say, because yesterday going on the bus, I was about to get on, it's like, oh wait, I gotta get the ramp down, because somebody had to exit, so it's like just on the bus, the ramp, so that it's accessible for people in wheelchairs or walkers.
Exactly. So many people don't know this, and you can test this and prove me wrong, but I've done the research and I've tested this out. I think I'm right. Every elevator in America pretty much has a closed door button. After the American with Disabilities Act came out, those were rendered inoperable. So current models, they took the wiring out and the button doesn't connect to anything. And in current models, they're still there for psychological reasons, for people to feel like they're not losing out. But the reason they were taken away, believe it or not, is that there was a lot of complaints to institutions in the government that when somebody who was able-bodied was in a elevator and they saw somebody with a wheelchair, they did not want to wait for that person and would use a closed door button to close the doors right in front of someone else and be discriminatory. So it became an act of discrimination. Think about that. When someone designed an elevator with a closed door button, I doubt very highly that they had that use case in mind. So all of us today walked in through the door of the touring lecture hall. Not everybody is that fortunate to be able to carry themselves with their own 2 feet. When you design something, you're designing from the perspective of people you've researched. But because you yourself aren't disabled in certain ways, and you haven't researched people with disabilities, this is a chance to start thinking about those things. And so, just like we talked about in the MVP lecture, like Facebook, in the good old days before the Russians, like there's a lot of problems of design and ethics where people are designing things and not considering how they could be used for evil, manipulated, or misused. When you design something, it's the intention to help the user, help the business. What actually gets done with your product is out of your control. Just like you design for scenarios that are likely, in the military, they design for like the bad and worst case scenarios. So there's like ideal scenarios and like negative scenarios that you can design for. I'm not saying go crazy and think about all these things all the time, but just goes to show a simple thing like an elevator button is an opportunity to be accessible. So designing something that's accessible is everyone or almost everyone with reasonable attempts can interact with it roughly equally. And considering that bell curve of, think of all the 5 senses and the physical body's ability to move. So we've got hearing, movement, sight, cognitive abilities, the amount of time that something takes to do. If there's a timeout counter on Eventbrite, it says you have like 3 minutes to fill this out. I always wonder why Eventbrite has that. There's probably business reasons for that, but I get annoyed. But if I have cognitive or physical disabilities, is that a realistic time frame? Maybe, maybe not. And I mean, basically, you're here to solve problems, not create new ones. You're here to build bridges, not to build walls. So when I zoomed out and I said, hey, all of us have been disabled or are currently disabled in some way, like, think of these 3 scenarios, okay? We have somebody with 1 arm. Maybe they were born with 1 arm. Maybe they're an Army veteran, got blown off. That person has 1 arm. Somebody has an injured arm. Temporary, maybe it's short term, maybe it's long term. Right there, it's in a sling, maybe it's in a cast. Now we have baby in one arm. Well, if you have the same device or app that a person is using, a lot of times on these big phablet phones, we don't even call them phablets because everything's big now, but on a phone, they're so big, sometimes the hit target's in the upper left, but most people are right-handed. But what if their right hand is no longer available? How are you going to design for that? So we have 3 scenarios: permanent, temporary, situational, or contextual, in which accessibility becomes something that is relevant to the user and therefore you as the designer. So often when people speak about and think about disability and therefore accessibility, they only think of the first person. When you design something that's truly accessible, there's the able-bodied person, the 4th person that's not pictured here, that you will design for. So good usability for one is good accessibility for others. And sometimes there can be conflicts if you're designing for a general population, but in my previous lecture, I talked about how design is all about trade-offs and constraints. You have to think about those things explicitly. Don't ignore them and don't have them be a second afterthought. So I'm not going to go through all the details. You can read this at your leisure. But basically, I talked about this before, where there's all the 5 senses, there's mobility, and there's cognitive. And all of these things have to do with all of the colors, the fonts, the times, the white space, all these things that are important and we critique you on. It's just a different lens to look through and see how do these decisions you're making, how are they impacting other people. You might have the best solution in the world, but if the people you seek to serve cannot use it, cannot access it, they're not able to due to their disability, then it doesn't matter if the solution exists or not. It's almost like even worse in some ways. Like picture like a thirsty person and they've been like going through the desert and there's like a bottle of water like on a string and they jump and it's too high and they can't get it. It's almost like, oh, I can see other taller people can drink the water and survive. That person in the desert dies. It's like a extreme hypothetical weird situation, but like essentially you're just kind of like, well, we didn't consider you, we don't care. It ultimately comes down to caring. We speak as an industry about empathy and research and getting in the shoes of other people. This is something that people don't empathize enough with. I worked on a project, actually, English as a second language. I worked on a project. It wasn't like for a company. This was a class I was taking. So how do you design a reading experience for people? So I picked a language that was like English, but not quite English. So there's this esoteric language called Afrikaans that's vaguely like English. And I took Curious George and I translated it, the ebook, into Afrikaans using Google Translate. And then I tried to read it. So it was harder for me to understand what I was reading, simulating having some kind of cognitive impairment, where it's a children's book, so it's simpler words, but I'm unable to read and then understand and comprehend. Designing for old people, I've designed projects for that where I put on goggles and put on Vaseline on the goggles and then put on like big winter gloves and like try to interact with like an app. For children, I did a project designing for children. I like put knee pads on and I spent like an afternoon at their eye level. And how do you, it's called body storming. So how do you empathize? So there are tools and ways you can put color filters online. You can squint your eyes. There's ways to really feel like a person who has these things every day. So can you think of any barriers that designers might face when creating accessible design? I'll get to you if somebody else doesn't have your hand up, but let's try to get other people engaged. Yes?
I think that something that comes up for me is like accessibility in terms of like having access to the technology to engage with your product. So like, I think we talked to a user that talked about an issue with like the homeless population in Chicago. But like, how do you design for them if maybe they don't have a phone or computer to interact with like the product you're trying to create?
So, in the traditional sense that we're talking about, accessibility doesn't extend to that point, but technically, accessibility,
Okay.
we're talking about the individual,
Okay.
but if we're talking about accessibility of cultures, of societies, of having access, I think it's a Venn diagram and an overlap with this topic. Really good to bring up. That typically is a more strategic business level, and design has a hand in that. And I don't want to dismiss it, but I don't think it's exactly on point with what we're talking about. But we should all be aware that not everyone is as privileged as us, and often we're designing for people unlike us. So it's a really good point that I think warrants further discussion outside of this lecture. But thank you for bringing that up. From a business perspective, people want to save time and money, so they're like, well, that's going to take extra time. Most of our users aren't blind. There's reasons we'll get into, basically compliance with the government and laws and being fined and sued. And then also, like, it actually doesn't take that much more time or money. And arguably, it makes for better design. And if your company cares about good design, they should care about accessibility. But ultimately, businesses make decisions based on profit and return on investment. But the whole idea is if you're going to dedicate thousands and millions of dollars and thousands of man hours to something, why would you limit that solution to a subset of the population? If spending an extra week or two could extend your product's reach to like 5% of the market more, that's a dollars and cents argument that will get stakeholders listening. There's lots of examples around you. So a woman recently died due to like medical complications and insurance discrimination issues that helped popularize these curbs that are wheelchair accessible in Chicago and throughout the country, but she was based in Chicago. And so we have a yellow curb denoting the visual change. There's these pads with the raised bumps, that's for canes, to know that there is a curb. Go to other countries. I know that they're not usually as accessible depending on the country. Like, I know Italy definitely isn't when I was there. And so in many ways, we set the standards for a while. I don't know, there's many other examples of countries that are better than us at this, but there's a lot of things around us. So keep an eye out for those things as an inspiration for how you can design. And so here's some examples of things in the digital world. Predictive text is an interesting one. So it says here that it was designed for motor impaired users. I would argue the keyboards are small, our hands are big, and it had to be predictive to some degree because there's just a lot of errors even with able-bodied people. And I feel like it's 2019 and we still don't have good keyboards on phones that are visual. But think about how hard it is for you to type the right words and how many times it's autocorrected to duck when it really wasn't. It's never duck. How many times are we talking about duck? You know? If it's hard for you to type, how hard would it be for somebody with misshapen hands, people without thumbs altogether? SMS actually, was designed originally for hearing impaired users. How could they communicate? Now, that's an example of how we all benefit from something. So who knows what can become of your designs when you're inclusive. When you're inclusive, more people get involved. When more people get involved and use it, the more they come up with their own hacks, their own tweaks, the more useful it becomes, the more value you provide the world. And closed captioning and subtitles are an example. I don't know if the sound's gonna work. I have 2 videos to show you. I'm gonna play both videos back to back, and then I just wanna hear any thoughts and feelings and whatever that comes up for you on these. So one video is from Microsoft. One video is from Apple. They are rivals. That's not the point. The point is they both recently-ish came out with videos that I think captured the energy, the essence, the reason why we should be inclusive. And I want you to pay attention to the emotional resonance in these videos, and also think about the design decisions. So I want you guys to take notes on this, like words, phrases, thoughts, so that you're able to bring up specifics.
Folks, we have a controller design that our fans love. However, for gamers with limited mobility or gamers who don't use both their hands, this controller design might not work best for them. Pushing another register.
Doorknobs are the worst thing ever invented. Putting on shoes, the cell phones that I use, these are the sorts of things that we don't think about until we have to. And I think about them every day. Yeah! I have cerebral palsy on my entire right side. This side of the controller is fine. This side doesn't have them. As the game platforms have gotten more sophisticated, the controllers have gotten more sophisticated, and it's starting to get really frustrating.
We designed the Xbox Adaptive Controller through feedback from the accessibility community.
The Xbox Adaptive Controller is very easy. You just plug it in, and you can plug in various other devices. I can make it work for me the way I ask you.
With the Xbox Adaptive Controller, a gamer can game with one hand and one foot, or one hand and their shoulder, or even one foot and their chin.
And I can change it from game to game.
Good, ready? Forward. Squeeze tongue. There it is.
Craig Hospital is a facility for patients who've either had a spinal cord injury or a traumatic brain injury, and it's a place for further rehab.
Yes. We're here for game night, and we're helping new patients getting back into gaming again. Is that the D-pad?
Yeah. Our role as occupational therapists is to get people back to doing. When the Xbox Adaptive Controller came along, it acted like an Xbox controller and just worked.
Uh-oh. Over there.
Ooh.
On the standard Xbox controller, it's just hard to press the buttons because you can't really put pressure through my hands. But then with the adaptive controller, I can use like larger joysticks, larger buttons that are easier to press and reach.
Corey and his brother Zachary are twins. Before Corey's injury, Zachary had gamed with him regularly, and that was the way that they related to each other as siblings.
Who do you love playing Xbox with here at Craig Hospital?
Zach.
The Xbox Adaptive Controller and the co-pilot feature allowed them again to play games together. So there's a huge social component to it.
You got that? Yes. Yes. They can play any game they want. I see the confidence just burst out of them.
So that's the first example. The team that created this has won lots of awards and is setting a trend, not only in the video games industry, but for the entire technology field. And for me is really inspirational. The next one is from Apple.
Wake up. Voice control is a breakthrough feature that gives you full control of your devices, with just your voice, period. It's a whole new way to do everything you love, period. Like this. Correct love. 16. Open photos. Scroll up. Show numbers. 13. Click share. 3. Tim. Next field. Let's try this one today. Thumbs up emoji. Click send. Open maps. Show grid. Long press it 20. Open app switcher. 4. Tap share. Tap Tim. Tap send. Hey, good to see you. Open music. Turn up the volume.
Notice how they used a scenario a story, and the design facilitated accomplishing a goal, just like we talk about in our program. So anyone can say anything that came up for them on either or both of the videos.
Okay, so the Microsoft one, I mean, even when you saw like Aaron, she says simple to like plug in. I think the fact that a lot of the stuff, like technology-wise, is getting more complex for everybody, like able users, non-able. So I think it's pretty neat how they made it super simple. It's just like there's two things they can use, a few little things here and there, but like it was all really simple to use. It was easy to go. I feel like it's a lot. It's like they said, mobility, we don't think about it until we have to. And that's another thing, like I didn't think about that either. I didn't think that there was gonna be an easier way for other people that, they're the same people, they just wanna play games too. Like it's kind of hard to think about that, especially nowadays when everyone's competing, you have, the Xbox and the PlayStation and Sony, everything. So everyone's trying to, the next big thing. So I think it's kind of neat how they found a simple solution to kind of include another demographic.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else?
When I was watching the Microsoft video, I think it kind of got me excited that I think sometimes I get discouraged on the UI side of things that okay, well I can make my things big enough and make the colors contrast, but what else can I really do? But I think it got me excited just thinking about some of the different directions, and even with the voice control that no, what if I can get really creative with creating micro interactions that use gestures that are easier for people with mobility concerns, or even when there's things like face recognitions, things like just the future of that, and thinking about micro interactions that are facilitating that stuff.
Yeah, and then your particular topic about the wheelchair use is very apropos. Yeah. One more. Anybody? Two more.
So the Microsoft one, I liked how they took the opportunity where a lot may think or associate disabilities with restriction, but they flipped it with the kid and his brother to have an opportunity to be even have something extra that they can do. I'm sure maybe it's not additional, maybe since the kid is pretty disabled, maybe that's a special part of their relationship, the brother helping the kid, but so it either enhanced that or provided a different opportunity to think about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking the way they labeled it too, the adaptive controller, it's not about the disability, but it's more about adapting to them. So
yeah.
It's not defining who the person or the gamer is, it's saying we're doing something different so you can use it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of flipping that.
Yeah. So Microsoft is becoming a leader in accessibility and inclusion on the hardware side, and Apple has been and is continuing to be more accessible on the software side. The voice control feature is new to iOS 13 and macOS Catalina. Android 10, because they just switched from being letters to numbers for whatever reason, has a live transcription feature for the Pixel 4 and flagship devices, where on board it uses AI to do transcription for people that have language issues or communication issues. It's really, really impressive that the AI can be done locally on the phone rather than going to the cloud. So when we talk about people who are of different socioeconomic ranges, maybe not have unlimited data plans, so that's merging the two then to have accessibility on their phones. So those are just two examples, but here's an example of when accessibility is ignored. In 2008, Target paid $6 million to settle a class action lawsuit brought by the National Federation of the Blind, and nearly $4 million more to cover the plaintiff's attorney fees and other costs. So there's a lot of businesses skirting by, hoping to get under the radar. I know the game of Uno and Lego are two new ones that have gotten Braille editions this past year. All these things, once your eyes are open, I feel like it's the effect. There's a psychological term for this, but if you buy a red car start noticing all like the red cars around you. It's like once you notice how like typefaces work in kerning, you notice all the crappy signs. Now take a look around you, like what's accessible, what's not, even in the WeWork building and around you in Chicago, you know? So some guidelines. We talked about like why it matters, what it is, guidelines. So the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, they developed these guidelines, and it goes from low to high, A to AAA. So it's like, how well is it accessible? Not just binary on or off, but how good is it? So there's these design principles, and they're similar to the usability heuristics, of which Nielsen Norman is most known for. But if you go for these guiding principles, perceivable, like the person needs to know that there's a stimulus, that there's something to interact with their senses. Operable, they have to be able to use it. They must be able to understand it. And robust. There's multiple ways to interact with and multiple ways to interpret what's going on. So I underlined user agents because when we talk about robustness, usually it's like, okay, you have an app or you have a website. You have a computer, a tablet, or phone, a watch. But let's think about a browser. A browser is a user agent in the technical jargon, and anything that can consume information from a server and give it to you is a user agent. So an app is a user agent. A website is a user agent. An Internet of Things is a user agent. It's acting on your behalf that you can interact with directly or indirectly to accomplish a goal. Now, the reason it's abstracted to user agents, including other assistive technologies, is that there are specific browsers and browser modes and plugins specifically made for people that are blind and deaf. And so you can't assume everybody's going to be using what you've heard of. Everybody knows of Firefox. Everyone knows of Chrome. Unfortunately, we all know about Internet Explorer. And Edge actually isn't bad anymore because it uses the core of Chrome. So I'm still going to bash it, but you can't really. So user agents will vary. This site, the Web Accessibility Initiative, by the consortium that develops web standards, this is an older screenshot, but if you were to do tests on this, it would be highly accessible. It's not it's not going to win any beauty pageant contests, but it is very accessible, and there's all the when I worked at Salesforce, there was just a guy, his entire job was to worry about all the products going through all of this and to test them, just as a bigger company, more specialization, that kind of thing. So pro tips. So providing text alternatives for non-text content. When you have an icon, is there a label underneath it? If there's just an icon, is there hover over text? If you're using a desktop, is there tooltips and stuff like that? Selecting colors with a significant contrast ratio. Certain colors are more likely to affect people with color blindness. For whatever reason, men have more color blindness than women, and there's different kinds of color blindness. Accessibility to the keyboard we spoke about, and I'm showing an example later about that, and allowing enough time, we talked about that. And then providing a clear and expected interface. So there's conventions in every interface. We know that typically on a website, menus are on the top or the left. They're usually not on the right. They're usually not on the bottom. These are design patterns that people come to expect. So when you leverage expected design patterns, whenever there's an ambiguous or new use case or scenario or feature, allowing users to default on the heuristics or the best practices that other companies and products and services have created helps for the cognitive load, and helps people with cognitive disabilities to work better with your, engage better with whatever you're designing. So technically speaking, alternative text is called alt text often, and that is in HTML code. You can identify an image with alt text, and that's for a screen reader, meaning a user agent that's similar to a web browser, but it just is audio only, will know how to go through a news story, and when it reaches a picture of the Syrian war, the caption is actually in the alt text, and it can describe the image itself, and then also read the caption that everyone can read. So it's a richer experience. So whenever not all websites are going to do this, but if you find a couple websites and go to the developer view source, you can take a look at, it says alt text in the HTML in I'm trying to remember what the terminology for that, in the tag. So the image would have a tag, and alt text is a property within the tag. And then there's a lot of things on YouTube and other video services where it automatically creates subtitles, automatically creates captions. So this is an example. So we have this image, and in the text of the code, alt as a part of the image tag, focus on grad Nikon camera's lenses up to 40% on. So even though this looks like text, it's actually like a flattened image, a JPEG, so that someone with vision impairments couldn't read it. So think about design for one, extend to many, in the beginning of our presentation. What does Google do? It scans the code. It can't scan, well, I guess it can. AI is great at Google. They could technically scan. I know their web crawlers are always evolving, but for simplicity's sake, not accuracy, they're scanning. I know the fact that they're scanning alt tags. They're also ranking when PageRank. How accessible is it? Not just how popular is it with PageRank. So there's all these things in their black box of an algorithm. We don't really know exactly what they're doing. They don't say don't be evil anymore, so it's probably being evil. But basically, it helps you get more exposure through web crawlers. So there's all these trickle-down benefits that are indirect, in addition to the direct benefits. So consider icons. Do we know what this flag means? These are two groups that are different, but they look the same. This is Facebook. We know that from the UI, the branding. Flag equals pages. That's weird. The other ones maybe you could ascertain, but there we go. So, accessible colors. This is for visual impairment. And you don't want to rely solely on color to convey information. We'll get to examples of that. So, good contrast. So we talk about the color of text, not literally the color, but if you squint your eyes, how can you read them? People with disabilities, this might help you simulate what they're going through. So these are some good guidelines for ratios of contrast of color and for sizes. So, basically, contrast is impacted by size. The reason is the negative space in the letters, the counters, and the negative space in between letters relative to all of the screen itself changes. And so you have to pay attention in the use case. If I'm designing for a presentation, my text will be bigger. I don't need as much contrast. If you're designing for a phone, smaller text, you're going to have higher contrast. So here are ways to create color palettes. Adobe Color. I believe they just updated their interface a couple months ago. Not sure how I feel about it, but it won't look exactly like this anymore. But you can download color palettes and as a starting point. And this image just says it all. In the middle, there's not contrast. On the edges, they are. And even there is contrast, the red and blue has a kind of like a flickering effect, for me at least, and I know for others. So you got to think about what are your options, what's effective and not as effective. Look, you can still read the bottom one, but can everyone still read that on that bell curve of accessibility? And how do you know that? We'll get into how you can know that with tools and ways to measure these objectively. So thinking about high and low contrast. And these examples on the right and these examples on the right, they're all relative to each other. But I don't know, is anyone else with the red and blue, it kind of looks like a little flickering or a little bit odd at the edges. So there's a lot of research that's been done into visual perception. So there's objectively what exists, and there's how our brains interpret it. That's why optical illusions exist. I had a psych class based around optical illusions, which sounded like the most fun thing ever. I almost failed it because it's actually very complicated, and there's so many competing visual systems that are counterintuitive to how your common sense would dictate, and it's really an art and a science. Who knew that would help me be a better designer? But there we go. This is in Trello. It's one of my favorite examples. Don't only rely on color. So there's a mode where colorblind mode. There's different patterns. Arguably, these patterns are the yellow and the red are too similar, but you kind of get the point that you can use patterns. There's a website, contrast-ratio.com, and you can test things out, and you get a number of the ratio, and you want to be within certain ranges that you can look up. This is another example. Here's a tool, I think it's called Stark, if I'm not mistaken, and so it's a plugin, and you can take a look at whether the image or thing that is capturing, get what if it's normal text, large text, and like the colors, the contrast ratios, do they get A, AA, AAA ratings from the standards we talked about earlier? And it looks like here that there's a color and a contrast mode on the right, and a way for you to export these results to share with a developer or stakeholder. You want to make sure everything is accessible with the keyboard. In the upper right, we have a form. Every form in HTML and in code of other kinds has what's called a tab order. So if you put your cursor and you type and you press tab, it'll go to the next one. There are so many forms that it kind of goes randomly because it was never assigned properly. So think about the logical order of things in your form. The tab order follows that logical order. So people without a mouse or who choose not to use one can do it. Does anyone use tab ordering at all? Okay, so try it out if you haven't. If you do it, you're benefiting from an accessibility feature. Here's an example. So something that we talk about in states, like hover state, in progress state. In a desktop mouse-driven world with keyboard accessibility in mind, it's animating that things have focus. So right now this has tab focus. So when you have multiple windows open, one is the frontmost one. Usually that has precedence in interaction, so that when you type, it's going to go to the frontmost window, to the first field in the tab order, and default to that hopefully. An accessibility and usability issue is if, this is Twitter as an example, the user taps new tweet, you could still have the right tab order, but it doesn't activate the first tab order. So ideally, when you create a new tweet, the user should be able to start typing right away versus having to press tab to go into the first field. There's ways to focus on those micro interactions and really do what's optimized for speed and efficiency. And notice how the tab order is changing, but in addition to it, there's other usability principles. The icons are given alt text or tooltips. And those tooltips are styled to be brand specific, even though there's a default on typical browsers and user agents. Way back in the day, like macOS system 8 and below, the tooltips could, like this, could incorporate video and audio also, so there could be a little bit of a tutorial thing. They no longer do that. Everything is a standard Windows-based, just text. But think about, at that point in the 90s, they were trying to create a more immersive, in-context experience that didn't become standardized. And I'm telling you about this esoteric feature that probably most people don't remember or know about, is that we have standards today because groups of people decided the DNA of the evolution of ideas, like what survived and what works in the market, And what we have today is the evolution of things that worked and things that didn't, but we're all benefiting, whether we realize it or not, from those past decisions. And there's no reason we can't look into the past for inspiration, because everything that's dead from the past, it's like fashion, everything that's old becomes new again. And so there's all these things when you're doing competitive analysis and research and looking at inspiration. Like, I think with flat design, there's less affordances. With less affordances of visual indicators of how things can be used, I would argue things are a little bit less usable. Usability's gone down, and if usability goes down, there's a risk that accessibility can go down as well. So not all the things that are cool and in fashion and in vogue today are good for accessibility and usability. So think about that a little bit. And giving users enough time. Usually this has to do with cognitive load. And what is your default if there is a time limit, and can the user adjust it? There's a great video game called Oxenfree, and it's an RPG, and it relies on dialogue, and I love the game, and I hate the game, and the reason I hate the game is the dialogue goes too fast, and if they could have allowed me to change it, the whole experience would have been wonderful. And if you go on Steam where it's sold, all the negative reviews are about the speed of the voices. I don't use Waze because it tells me to turn way too slowly. So by the time I get there, it's like, that's not adjustable. So that's my preferences. But taken to that logical conclusion, to the extreme, people may not have preferences that are in the mainstream. They may have needs that are beyond the mainstream. So think about that. Provided clear and expected interface, following common design patterns, and don't reinvent the wheel for icons all because you can. So these are all detailed things. I harp on using animation and video mindfully and purposefully, but also be careful. Give you a chance to read these. But basically, every little aspect has implications. Every element of design has implications in usability and accessibility. So in practice, you can use the No Coffee Vision Stimulator Chrome extension to simulate what it might be like to have certain visual impairments, and you can adjust the sliders to body storm to come up with ideas and empathize with people with disabilities. So don't do this now, but you could follow these instructions to turn on accessibility. If you have the new Catalina feature of voice control, you can look up how to do that. But basically, you all can go to System Preferences, and in Catalina, this looks different, but accessibility, there's different things you can play with. So in the newest version of iOS, accessibility was in settings in the previous version under general. So you have to go settings, general, accessibility. In iOS 13, accessibility is in settings, no longer in general, it's got top billing. So Apple is one of the most profitable companies in the world, and the most innovative, though not so much recently, companies in the world decided that accessibility was so important they put it on a top level system preferences. So think about that. If they think it's important, maybe we should consider that as well. So resources, we've got all these links, and then as per usual, my added content as well. So if we take a look at accessibility inclusion, we've got different articles about accessibility that extend the content of the lecture, and then infographics that help you understand what accessibility is. So this is like an informational graphic summary of all of the things that accessibility talks about. And then this is a I don't know what you would call it exactly, but it's a sketch noting of the top level things to think about as a cheat sheet. This woman, Christina, I won't pronounce her last name correctly, but she's on Medium. She does all these great things for UX, all these like sketch noting. So this is kind of a cheat sheet also, if you want. So I acknowledge that you're not producing something real in code in the world. You're producing an MVP and a conceptual manifestation of it. But if I see as your instructor, any accessibility issues, I'll bring them up now that you're aware of them. And as a stakeholder in the government, and with Voluntopia, maybe it's a nonprofit, but they're usually donation-based and they involved with the government and regulations are there, would be very concerned if things were not accessible and not inclusive. And then, it may not keep you up at night, but how are you going to think of yourself as an ethical designer making the best impact in the world? These are aspirational goals that I hope some of you have, if not all. So this isn't 100% directly applicable to this project, but I will want you to consider this in the final resolution, the visuals of this MVP, the prototype, the micro interactions, the color choices, the font sizes, the contrast, all this stuff. But a lot of this information is overkill for this particular sprint, but to know beyond the program, this is still important. Hey, we got 6 minutes, so questions?
I understand like more of the tools that people with various accessibility concerns use on a desktop, like setting to access websites or web apps or other products, but I feel like I don't understand as much from a mobile perspective, like what are I know like Apple has this voice control thing, but what are like some of the other tools that people use on their phones?
So Apple is a more locked down ecosystem, and they use a framework of architecture called sandboxing, which doesn't allow apps to talk to other apps as much. And often the reason that Chrome is so popular and useful to people with accessibility issues is you can have plugins to change things, and a desktop is an open ecosystem that isn't through an app store. So it's not surprising that you're not as aware, because the platform doesn't allow for as many options. And often accessibility, it's a smaller market, so there's more pricey options that are not designed as well, that are more niche and therefore aren't as prevalent on some platforms. That being said, I would do some research and try to find on the App Store and off the App Store what conversation is going on about these things. Android is more accessible and interoperable, and they have APIs do people know what APIs are? No? Application program interfaces. So one program does its own thing, but it has these certain bits of code that allow it to talk to other software that does its own thing, but it has bits and code to talk to other software. So it's almost like these communication channels. So if I want to use text from one app and paste it in another, or take video from one app and put captions on another, APIs allow them to talk to each other so that one app has to do everything. Android is more open, more modifiable at the core architecture, kernel level, the underpinnings of the operating system. Apple is a pioneer in a lot of these accessibility things, but because they create a closed sandbox system, it makes it antithetical to some people in the who have accessibility needs. What I will say is maybe even broaden your perspective a little bit. Consider people with autism. There are apps on the App Store that allow people to communicate with each other in the world, interact with the world using pictorial boards where they can produce sentences by picking things off a grid. One of the apps has I forget the name of, Piccolo or something. It has a icon of I think stupid looking owl, but it has this, but because it's such a niche market, it's like a $300 app where most apps cost like $5 or less, and then it's horribly designed. And so the App Store allows for a lot of these sandboxed single purpose things, but on the desktop it's really wonderful when so on the desktop there's on Mac there's AppleScript, And so in the accessibility community, they write all these script, like JavaScript on the web, but for the Mac, to like have things talk to each other in ways they weren't meant to talk to each other. And then I know for a fact there are people hacking the Microsoft adaptive controller to work with those things, but it's only because the community creates these homebrew things. And so the more closed off the system, the harder it is. So I don't know the specifics of what's available, but it's not the best. It's not designed from a platform core level to be as accessible, unfortunately. Yeah. Okay, you guys might be lectured out today. There's a lot to go through. Yeah, well, thank you for your time, and consider at some point how your MVP will be accessible and inclusive. And don't make any glaring errors that I can catch you on in critique and check-ins. And time box these kinds of activities and discussions, but have them be a part of the progression of your idea into an MVP.